Daniel Reeves kissed his wife goodbye and promised to be home by Sunday, but neither he nor their 9-year-old son, Ethan, ever returned. What began as a peaceful father-son canoe trip turned into a mystery that haunted a town for over a decade. With no bodies, no evidence, and no answers, Marissa Reeves was left alone, grieving 2 lives lost to the water. But 12 years later, a single phone call would unravel everything she thought she knew and expose a secret more shocking than anyone could imagine. On the morning of June 12, 2013, the town of Redwood Springs stirred to life under a pale orange sky. The streets were still quiet, most families still indoors as the sun crept slowly above the treetops. Daniel Reeves stood outside his modest 2-bedroom home, carefully strapping a red canoe to the roof of his pickup truck. A thermos of coffee steamed gently on the hood. In the passenger seat, his 9-year-old son Ethan waited silently, bundled in a puffy blue jacket and cradling a small tackle box on his lap. It was the first father-son trip they'd taken alone, and Daniel had insisted on keeping it simple: no electronics, no distractions, just the lake, the woods, and each other. Mirror Lake was a quiet, out-of-the-way place nestled deep in the hills of upstate New York. Not many knew about it, and that was what Daniel liked most. He'd visited as a boy, back when his own father was still around, and had always found the calmness of the water almost sacred. He said it was the kind of place where silence didn't feel empty, it felt peaceful. That's what he told Marissa the night before as she packed sandwiches and reminded him to take extra socks. She trusted him. Daniel was steady, reliable, not the kind of man who made rash decisions. He'd been a school teacher for over 10 years, known around town for his gentle nature and easy smile. They left just after 6 a.m. Daniel waved to a neighbor as the truck rolled out of the driveway. Ethan stared out the window, eyes fixed on the blur of green trees as they sped by. By noon, the truck was found parked near a narrow dirt path that led through the forest to the edge of Mirror Lake. Rangers remembered seeing it later that afternoon, but they thought nothing of it. It was summer campers came and went all the time. That evening, Marissa didn't worry when they didn't call. Daniel had mentioned there'd be no cell service near the lake. She assumed they were roasting marshmallows by a fire or casting lines into the water, bonding in the way fathers and sons should. But when Sunday evening came and passed with no call, no sign, and no return, something inside her shifted. It wasn't panic at first, just a quiet unease. She left voicemails, then texts. By Monday morning, she called the local police. What followed was a blur of flashing lights, dogs barking through the woods, helicopters sweeping across the lake's surface. Dive teams plunged into the icy water, and volunteers combed through the forest trails with flashlights and walkie-talkies. The red canoe was discovered around noon on Tuesday, floating upside down near the far end of the lake. It was waterlogged but intact. A life jacket was tangled in a branch along the shore, no footprints, no blood, no sign of struggle. By Friday, the official story had formed. The canoe must have flipped. Maybe Daniel tried to save Ethan and they both drowned. The lake was deep and filled with weeds in some parts, dangerous even for strong swimmers. Despite the extensive search, neither body was recovered. The water gave up nothing. The current was too slow to carry them far, but no one could explain why they vanished without a trace. The town mourned. A vigil was held at the local church. Candles were lit and flowers left on the front steps of the Reeves home. Marissa stood among friends and neighbors, too numb to cry. In interviews, she spoke softly about Daniel's love for nature, Ethan's shy smile, and how she still believed somehow that they were out there, but time wore her down. A memorial was eventually erected near the lake. It listed their names and the date they disappeared. As months turned to years, the story faded from the news. The search was called off officially in 2014. Daniel Reeves and his son became part of local legend, their photos framed on the wall of the sheriff's office next to other cold cases. A father and son lost to the lake, a sad story, a cautionary tale. But for Marissa, nothing about the story made sense. Daniel knew how to swim. He was cautious, methodical. He wouldn't have taken Ethan out in rough weather, and the skies that weekend had been perfectly clear. There had been no storm, no strong wind, no current to sweep them away. She kept replaying everything: his behavior before the trip, the way he had been distant the past few weeks, how he had avoided looking her in the eyes that morning. Still, there was no evidence of foul play. No note, no goodbye, just silence, stretching for days, months, years. People told her to move on, to find peace, but how do you bury someone when there's no proof they're gone? Some nights she would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching cars pass by, imagining that maybe, just maybe, one of them would stop in front of her house and Daniel and Ethan would step out. They never did. Until one day, 12 years later, she received a call from a stranger. A voice from the desert. And suddenly, everything she thought she knew about that morning at Mirror Lake began to unravel. The story had remained dormant for over a decade, buried under years of silence, memorial services, and fading memories. Most people in Redwood Springs no longer spoke about Daniel and Ethan Reeves. Their disappearance had gradually become a sad tale people told newcomers, about the father and son who went canoeing and never came back. But for Marissa Reeves, the silence never settled. She lived in a house too quiet for comfort, where the air always seemed heavy with something unspoken. She still kept the same landline number, just in case, and never let go of the faint possibility that one day something would shift. That shift came in the form of a voicemail. A soft, uncertain male voice filled her phone one cold December evening in 2024. The caller claimed to have met someone years earlier who introduced himself as Dan Rivers. The man lived quietly in the desert, off the grid, with a boy who looked like he could be his son. The caller said that after seeing an old missing persons flyer online, he felt compelled to reach out. He didn't leave a name or a callback number. He just said he thought she should know. Marissa played the message over and over. The words seemed too strange to believe, but too specific to ignore. She tried contacting the local police. They listened politely, but ultimately told her there was no real lead, nothing they could act on. As far as the state was concerned, Daniel and Ethan were deceased. The file was closed, the death certificates had been issued, and the canoe incident ruled an accidental drowning. But in her heart, the call felt like something else, an answer trying to break through the surface after years of still water. Refusing to let the moment slip away, Marissa contacted a private investigator named Lydia Crane. Lydia had a reputation for solving the kinds of cases others gave up on. She didn't promise miracles, only facts. Marissa gave her everything she had: photos, financial records, email trails from before the disappearance, and of course the voicemail. Lydia began working her way backward, looking for anyone who might have used the name Don Rivers in the years following 2013. Months passed with few results. Lydia uncovered nothing at first, only a few scattered mentions of men using the name Rivers for odd jobs in rural Arizona and New Mexico. But eventually a pattern began to take shape. Someone named Daniel Rivers had rented a storage unit in northern Arizona. The rental records showed consistent cash payments for 6 years. There was no ID photo on file, just a signature that looked strangely familiar to Marissa. That led Lydia to a remote property and unlisted shack purchased in cash under a false name 2 years prior. Then came the photo. Lydia managed to obtain security camera footage from a gas station 20 miles from the property. It was dated 3 months before the call. In the footage, a man fitting Daniel's description was seen filling up a red jerrycan. He looked older, more weathered, but unmistakably him. Standing next to him was a tall teenager, his face partially turned away. The image was grainy, but when Marissa saw the boy's profile, her breath caught. The resemblance to Ethan was undeniable. The way he stood, the slope of his shoulders, the curve of his face, he looked like a memory brought to life. Lydia and Marissa flew to Arizona in March 2025. After hours of driving across dry desert roads, they found the shack tucked into a rocky hillside. It looked abandoned, almost forgotten by time. But there were signs of recent activity: 2 folding chairs, a small fire pit, a clothesline with a few faded shirts swaying in the wind. Inside the shack, it was sparse but functional. A small bedroll lay near the wall. A map of Arizona had been pinned above a makeshift desk. Notes in Daniel's handwriting dotted the margins, cryptic reminders and marked locations. Marissa spotted it in a wooden crate beneath the floorboards, a photograph of her, Daniel and Ethan from a summer camping trip? The edges were curled, the colors faded, but the moment it captured was vivid in her mind. She had searched for that photo years ago, thinking it was lost in the chaos after the disappearance. Now it sat in her hands, proof that Daniel had kept a piece of their old life, even in hiding. The investigator reported the discovery to local authorities, who coordinated with federal agencies. They moved quietly, tracking Daniel's movements based on the clues from the shack. He was eventually found alone at a rural gas station, using cash to buy groceries and supplies. When officers approached him, he didn't run. He didn't protest. He simply gave his name as Daniel Reeves. The news traveled quickly. A man believed dead for 12 years had been living under an alias. A child presumed drowned had grown up in the shadows. The world responded with shock, confusion, and curiosity. Everyone had the same question. Why would a man fake his own death and vanish with his son? As the headlines exploded and speculation mounted, Marissa sat quietly in her hotel room, staring out at the vast Arizona landscape. For 12 years, she had carried the grief of 2 deaths. Now she faced something even more disorienting. The knowledge that they had been alive the entire time, just beyond reach, living a life she was never meant to see. Daniel Reeves sat in a small interrogation room in Flagstaff, Arizona, under the harsh glare of a ceiling light. He looked tired but not surprised. His hair was streaked with gray, and a thick beard hid much of his face, but beneath it all, the man who once disappeared from Mirror Lake was still there. Law enforcement expected resistance, denial, or confusion, but what they got was quiet cooperation. He confirmed his identity. He acknowledged the name Daniel Rivers was false. He didn't ask for a lawyer. When pressed for details, he simply said, "I did what I thought was right." He just knew his father woke him early that morning and told him they had to leave everything behind. But in the end, he let him go. Ethan enrolled in community college using falsified documents and got a part-time job. He had been slowly trying to build a normal life, though the fear of being discovered never left him. Others viewed him as selfish, a man who had stolen a child's identity and robbed a mother of her family for over a decade. Experts debated whether his actions constituted kidnapping, psychological abuse, or something else entirely. The emotional damage, however, was undeniable. He showed little emotion in court, except when Ethan appeared briefly during proceedings. The two locked eyes but didn't speak. Marissa attended every hearing, sitting silently in the front row. There were no embraces, no tears, just quiet understanding. It was the beginning of something uncertain, fragile, but real. The truth had come out, and though it left scars, it also brought something Ethan had never truly had before choice. She never approached Daniel, never looked at him longer than necessary. She was there for Ethan, not for the man who had stolen 12 years of her life. He recalled hiking for hours, then getting into another car hidden in the woods. From that point forward, they were different people. Daniel was sentenced to 8 years in prison with no chance of early release. The judge called his actions a long deception that inflicted permanent harm. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, but Marissa and Ethan slipped away unnoticed. He had sold personal belongings under the table, withdrawn cash in small amounts to avoid suspicion, and secretly purchased a second vehicle registered under a fabricated identity. He'd even scouted locations where they could live undetected. Mirror Lake wasn't chosen at random. It was remote, quiet, and easily manipulated for what he needed to stage. He said he never questioned it at first because he trusted his father, but over time the weight of secrecy wore him down. He described mounting pressure at home, though Marissa had never filed for divorce or any legal action. He claimed she was preparing to leave him and had threatened to take Ethan with her. He issued a single written statement through a court-appointed advocate. In it, he said he loved both his parents but was still processing what had been done. He acknowledged that his father raised him with care but also with fear. He expressed a desire to reconnect with his mother, though he admitted it would take time. He ended the letter by saying he hoped to live life on his own terms now, without secrets. There was no documented evidence to support this claim, and Marissa denied it completely. Regardless, Daniel insisted he felt cornered. He believed faking their deaths was the only way to keep his son. He missed normal things, school, friends, even being able to speak freely without watching for signs they were being followed. Authorities had many questions, but one mattered more than the rest where was Ethan. Daniel gave them a name and a location. He said Ethan was safe, living under a new identity in New Mexico. He spoke carefully, his voice steady. He told authorities he'd known since he was 12 that something about their life wasn't T-normal. He said Daniel never let them stay in one place for long. They lived in trailers, cabins, and even cars for a time. They never used real names, never got close to anyone. For most of his teenage years, he was homeschooled using outdated textbooks and handwritten lesson plans. He didn't understand what had happened at Mirror Lake until he was old enough to piece it together on his own. According to him, Ethan had left voluntarily 2 years ago to attend community college. They still spoke occasionally, but Ethan had made it clear he wanted space. Agents located the young man 2 days later in a small town near Santa Fe. He was found living in a shared apartment with 2 roommates, using a name that didn't appear in any national databases. When questioned, he confirmed his true identity. He was Ethan Reeves' missing child, now 21 years old. Ethan was calm but visibly guarded. Ethan said he didn't remember the moment they left the lake clearly. At 19, Ethan told Daniel he wanted to go out on his own. They argued. Daniel resisted. Back in Arizona, investigators combed through Daniel's background and discovered he had been planning his disappearance for months before it happened. According to his confession, Daniel's decision to disappear was driven by a growing fear of losing custody of Ethan. The public reaction was swift and divided. Some people saw Daniel as a desperate father who had made an irreversible decision out of love. As the media storm intensified, Ethan declined all interview requests. Daniel was formally charged with multiple counts, including kidnapping, identity fraud, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom was quiet when the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. For the first time in over a decade, mother and son sat together in the same room. The trial had ended, the cameras were gone, and Daniel Reeves sat behind the walls of a federal prison, beginning the sentence he had crafted for himself long ago. For most people, this would have been the conclusion of the story. But for Marissa and Ethan, the aftermath brought a different kind of reckoning, one that couldn't be neatly resolved by a court decision. What followed wasn't just about recovery. It was about facing what had been lost, what had been hidden, and what had never been truly understood. Ethan moved to New York 2 months after the sentencing. He didn't go back to the house he'd grown up in, nor did he stay with Marissa. Instead, he rented a small apartment in a nearby town, trying to keep a manageable distance as he slowly found his footing. Re-entering a world that had kept going without him wasn't easy. He didn't have a valid social security number. His high school education wasn't officially recorded. He had never had a driver's license, a medical record, or even a proper birth certificate since his disappearance. He existed in the system as a ghost, and now he had to rebuild his identity from the ground up. Marissa worked tirelessly behind the scenes to help him. She coordinated with lawyers, local officials, and government agencies to piece together the legal recognition of his existence. It took months of paperwork, sworn affidavits, and the help of a court-appointed guardian to re-establish Ethan as a living citizen. Slowly, bit by bit, the foundations of a normal life were laid. A temporary ID was issued. An official birth certificate was refiled. His college credits were salvaged with help from affidavits written by professors who had taught Eli Rivers, his assumed name. Through all of it, Ethan remained cautious and quiet, unsure how to handle the weight of a mother he hadn't seen since he was 9, and the guilt of knowing she'd lived in mourning while he was alive. They met once a week, usually on Saturday afternoons. The first meetings were stiff and brief. Marissa would sit across from him at a cafe table, hands around her mug, trying not to ask too much. Ethan answered what he could, but often looked out the window, retreating behind long pauses. They were strangers with a shared history, and neither of them knew how to bridge the years between them. Over time, the meetings grew longer. Ethan began to share more what his life had been like, the constant moving, the rules Daniel had made, the times they'd almost been caught. He spoke of hiding in cars, camping for weeks in forests, using burner phones, and the moment he realized he didn't want to keep running anymore. Marissa listened, heartbreaking all over again, but she didn't cry. She knew tears wouldn't help him now. He didn't need guilt or pity. He needed time, space, and patience, and that she could give him. Meanwhile, Daniel's story continued to draw attention, especially from true crime communities and independent investigators. Some called him a cult-like figure. Others painted him as a tragic father driven to extremes. He received letters in prison, mostly from strangers, some sympathetic, others condemning. But Daniel rarely responded. In his own way, he had finally become the ghost he had tried to become 12 years ago. Disconnected, silent, faded. Despite the growing interest in the case, Marissa declined all interview requests. She turned down book offers, podcast appearances, and documentaries. She had no interest in turning the worst years of her life into a spectacle. She only gave one written statement to the press. "My son is alive, and that's all I need." Ethan said nothing at all. His goal was simple: build a life that belonged to him and no one else. By the end of the year, Ethan had enrolled in a new university under his real name. He majored in environmental science, inspired by the years he'd spent in the wild. He said that even though the reasons for that life had been wrong, the connection he developed to nature had been real. He wanted to use it now, not to run, but to build. Marissa began volunteering with a support network for families of missing children. She never spoke about her own case, but she helped others write letters, navigate government forms, and keep going when hope felt impossible. She understood what it meant to wait in silence, to believe in something others had long given up on. As the seasons turned, something subtle changed between Marissa and Ethan. Their meetings became less formal. They started taking walks after lunch, visiting parks, sharing old photos. One day, Ethan asked if he could see the house where he grew up. Marissa didn't hesitate. They stood in front of the weathered porch where he used to play with his toy dinosaurs. The backyard was smaller than he remembered. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. No one could undo the years they had lost. There would always be gaps in their stories, questions with no answers, and wounds that never fully closed. But in the quiet moments, there was peace, not because everything had been made right, but because the truth, once buried, had finally been brought into the light. And now, both mother and son could choose what came next. 1 year after Daniel Reeves was sentenced to prison, the world had moved on from the headlines. The media frenzy surrounding his reappearance had faded into the background, replaced by newer scandals and fresh tragedies. For most people, his case was just another story of a man who vanished and was later found, his secrets exposed. But for those directly affected, the end of the trial marked the beginning of something much more complicated. Ethan Reeves continued his life quietly, away from the spotlight. He was now in his second semester of college, living under his real name, slowly piecing together a future he could call his own. He had started to make friends, though he kept most people at arm's length. He rarely spoke of his past, and when he did, he framed it like it belonged to someone else. In many ways, it did. The boy who had lived in the shadows, constantly moving, always looking over his shoulder, was gone. In his place stood a young man trying to learn how to live in the world without fear. But freedom came with its own challenges. Ethan struggled with guilt, not for what had happened, but for what he hadn't done. He had known, deep down, that something about their life wasn't right. As a child, he had trusted his father completely. He had accepted their lifestyle because it was all he knew. But once he began to understand the truth, that they had faked their deaths, that his mother had been left to grieve a lie, he hadn't spoken up. He had stayed silent. He had kept the secret, and that silence haunted him. He began seeing a counselor through his university, someone trained in trauma and reintegration. Slowly, he learned to understand that survival and complicity were not the same. He had been a child, manipulated by the only adult in his life. The choices had never truly been his. Accepting that didn't erase the damage, but it gave him a framework to move forward. Marissa, too, was rebuilding. She had returned to her job at the library, where things felt safe and quiet. She never expected her life to go back to the way it was. Too much had changed. The person she had been 12 years ago, the wife, the mother, the hopeful woman who waved goodbye that morning, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, quieter, shaped by years of not knowing. She and Ethan were closer now. Their relationship was still healing, but the walls had come down. They spoke more often, shared meals, even went on short weekend hikes like they used to when he was little. Sometimes they talked about Daniel. Not often and never for long, but enough to acknowledge the presence he still had in their lives. In prison, Daniel had become a model inmate. He kept to himself, read constantly, and worked in the facility library. He didn't write to Marissa. He sent one letter to Ethan shortly after his sentencing. It wasn't an apology nor an explanation, it was more of a confession. In it, Daniel admitted that he had begun planning their disappearance long before that trip to Mirror Lake. He had convinced himself that he was rescuing his son, but in truth, he had been running from his own failures, financial stress, marital strain, fear of losing control. He wrote that he had believed in the moment that what he was doing was an act of love, but now he saw it as cowardice. Ethan didn't respond to the letter. He read it once, folded it, and placed it in a box at the back of his closet. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he also wasn't ready to hate. He had learned that some truths don't fit into easy categories. His father had given him both protection and pain, love and control. Sorting through that would take time, maybe a lifetime. One autumn evening, Ethan and Marissa visited Mirror Lake for the first time since the search ended 12 years earlier. The trees were turning orange and red, and the air was crisp. They stood in silence by the water's edge, looking out at the place where the canoe had been found. It was peaceful, too peaceful to match the weight of the memory. Ethan skipped a stone across the surface, watching the ripples stretch out in widening circles. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The silence was no longer hollow, it was full of shared understanding. In the months that followed, Ethan gave a private talk at his university. It wasn't publicized, and only a small group of students attended. He didn't name names or reveal specifics. He simply spoke about identity, about what it means to lose yourself and then try to find your way back. He talked about fear and resilience and the importance of owning your story, even when that story begins in a lie. As the years passed, the story of Daniel and Ethan Reeves faded from public memory. But in one small town and one quiet home, the impact remained. There were no perfect endings, no complete resolutions. Just people learning to live with what they had been given and what had been taken away. And sometimes, that was enough. For Marissa and Ethan, the truth was no longer something to fear. It was a foundation broken, uneven, but real. And from that, something new could grow.